Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Varon.
Part 20. Memorable Delight. Tiz's father Carlos, brother Davi and friend Yara managed to find Tiz at the hospital, having unsuccessfully looked for her at the Sparkling Delight brothel, and the family is reunited. Tiz is taken for a last visit to the seaside by her friend Chinn, her young brother, and the young English doctor Aidan and his wife and baby daughter. Chinn enables her to bathe in the sea, so giving her a beautiful experience in her sad and tragic life.
Kirsty and Sister Maria were sharing a cup of cavazzino together on the porch. Joy, cradled on the nun's lap, was waving her arms and gurgling as she gazed into Maria's face. The sister was whispering to her in Portuguese, and the baby seemed to understand every word. At last Maria looked up, and with a grave face remarked,
"I'm sorry Tiz is so ill, Kirsty. It must have been a hard blow for Aidan when she was officially diagnosed with AIDS-related pneumonia." "Yes, it was," agreed Kirsty, sighing. "Dr. Ramirez is doing all he can, but she seems to be deteriorating despite their best efforts. She improved a bit at first, but she's fading now, I'm afraid." "Does Davy know?" the nun inquired. "We've told him that there's a chance that she won't recover," replied Kirsty sadly, "but I don't think he wanted to believe us." "He's a remarkable little boy," she added. "He's a real help to me with Joy in the house, and I'm teaching him English too." She smiled to herself, thinking of the child's loyalty and determination. "He's brilliant in the market too," she added, sniffing out bargains and carrying my shopping for me. "Yara's also doing well in her cleaning job at the hospital," remarked the sister. "She's good with the patients and cheerful. If she wants to stay, I'm sure she could." "That would be wonderful for her," replied Kirsty sincerely. "She can make a fresh start and put the horror of the past few years behind her, couldn't she?" "It's not as easy as that," said Maria sadly. "Now she's been sexually ill-used for so long, even though she's escaped, it will live with her for the rest of her life and affect everything she tries to do. But," she added, smiling, "Yara is strong both mentally and physically, so maybe she'll make something of herself. Lots of prostitutes are like Tiz, though," she said gravely. "I'm afraid we see many young women in the hospital who have been abused in exactly the same way, and even if their bodies recover, their minds don't." As she said these words, the nun's normally serene face looked deeply troubled. Silence fell between them, and Kirsty, distressed by what she had just heard, gazed out of the veranda at a nearby magnolia. It had only just stopped raining, and the shiny wet surface of each dark green leaf was glistening in the sunlight, as if it had just been polished. "So much beauty, but so much pain," she said to herself, and the thought made her feel helpless and angry. "Sister," she said at last, "how do you cope with the misery of life? You see so much of it, and yet it doesn't seem to crush you like it does me. I'm only helping one girl, but sometimes I lie in bed and think about all the others. Then I just want to run away and hide." "That's a question I get asked a lot," replied Maria, smiling. "Over the years I've come to realise that there are two things that keep me loving and energised. The first will encourage you to keep going. It's this: I concentrate on what I can do, not what I can't. The second concerns my personal faith, so won't help you much, but I'll share it anyway. You see, I have a God who suffers with the helpless. He's not outside their pain, just observing. He shares it, and that makes all the difference to me." She looked gravely at Kirsty and added, "Each time I look at Tiz, it's him I see."
Later on that morning, Kirsty, Joy and Tiz were sitting under a tree looking at the view. The air was oppressively hot, and Kirsty thought longingly of walks on the downs on April days, of the refreshing feel of a cold, wet wind on her face, and the sight of wispy white clouds scudding across the sky. She turned and looked at Tiz, who was half asleep in her wheelchair beside the bench.
"How ill she looks," thought Kirsty sadly. "We've all tried so hard, but she's failing fast." Then, thinking back to what Sister Maria had told her earlier, she gave herself a good mental shake. "I'm doing what I can," she said to herself, "and even if Tiz's body is dying, her spirit is reviving with all our love and care. She seems to be coming alive again while we watch."
Sensing Kirsty's gaze, Tiz turned and looked at her.
"What are you thinking, Signora Kirsty?" she inquired. "You look sad." "Tiz," replied Kirsty, "is there anything you want to do that I could arrange for you?" There was a pause whilst Tiz thought this over. At last she replied, "Yes, there's one thing I long to do every day, and that's to go back to the sea. I've only been once. That was when I met Signor Aidan for the second time, and it was the most wonderful experience of my life. I want to go again so badly. It hurts me deep down inside every time I look at it from up here on this seat." As she said this, she gazed wistfully at Kirsty and clasped her hands tightly together. "I'll see what I can do," said Kirsty firmly. "I'm sure we can work out a way of getting you to the beach. I'll talk to Aidan about it." "Obrigada, Signora Kirsty," said Tiz, her eyes shining. "That would mean so much to me." "Aidan," said Kirsty as she lay in her husband's arms that night, "Tiz would like to go to the sea. It's her dearest wish. She told me this morning. Do you think we could take her?"
There was a pause as Aidan thought through this request. At last he said hesitatingly, "I suppose so. It'll be a strain on her. But I don't think she has long left," he added sadly. "So it would be good for her to do something she really wants." Kirsty let out her breath in a sigh of relief, as she'd been afraid that the doctor in Aidan would say it was too dangerous. A thought then occurred to her.
"Do you think we could take Davi and perhaps Chinn too? Yara will be working, though."
"I suppose so," he replied. "I don't expect it makes much difference how big the party is, and I'm sure it would do Davy good to go to the beach. Take his mind off Tiz for a few hours. I'll borrow the hospital minibus," he added. "Then we'll have room for all the gear Joy will need as well. Let's go the day after tomorrow, shall we?" The bus nosed its way out of the hospital gates 2 days later, and Kirsty settled back in her seat to enjoy the journey. Tiz sat beside her gazing out of the window, and Kirsty realised that even though she was very ill, Tiz was enjoying herself. Davy was talking excitedly to Chinn behind her, and although the latter said nothing in reply, the little boy didn't seem to notice, and went on chattering away in Portuguese. Joy was also awake, sitting contentedly in her baby seat beside him.
"Perhaps," she thought, wishing she could understand what he said, "Davy is talking to the baby and not to Chinn at all." As the bus threaded its way along the busy city streets, Kirsty noticed that the pavements were thronged with young couples. Many of the girls were in their best clothes and looked so happy that the little party in the minibus began to feel that the whole city was sharing the joy of their outing. "Why is everybody dressed up?" Kirsty asked at last. "Because," replied Tiz, "it's o dia dos namorados, meaning the day for young lovers and courting couples, when all the young men must give their girls a present if they love them. See, they've brought them flowers to put in their hair," she said, pointing to a group of young men and women laughing and joking on the pavement.
Kirsty could see indeed that the men were in their best clothes, and that all the girls had many coloured blossoms in their dark hair, which made them look like an excited flock of exotic tropical birds. Soon, however, the city was left behind, and the bus began to wind its way along a quiet road, which ran beside the edge of the estuary. The journey was not a long one, as the confluence of river and sea was not too far from the city.
When they arrived at the quiet beach which Dr. Ramirez had suggested to Aidan, they could see that the white sands were deserted, save for a few brightly coloured fishing boats drawn up above the high water mark.
"Why don't we go and sit on the shady side of that blue boat?" suggested Aidan, pointing. "We can't stay in the full sun, that's for sure." So he and Chinn carried Tiz's wheelchair between them and put it beside the boat. Then Chinn fetched Tiz and carefully arranged her chair so that the vessel's peeling sides shaded her from the sun. All the others sat on blankets on the sand, with baby Joy asleep close to Kirsty. The air was fresh and invigorating after the heat of the city, and the sea was so calm that it appeared almost motionless. Only the tiny wavelets gently breaking on the shore reminded them that a few miles beyond the headland at the bay's entrance, the real ocean began. Overhead the seagulls wheeled and called as they swept to and fro across an azure sky.
Presently Joy woke up, and Aidan carried her down to the water's edge to dabble her feet. The baby was immediately captivated with both water and sand, and laughed and gurgled in delight. He then brought her back up the beach to Kirsty, who dried her legs and fed her.
Instead of sitting back down on the blanket, however, Aidan turned to Davy, saying, "Come on, Davy, let's make a sandcastle." Davy looked at him questioningly, not knowing what Aidan wanted him to do. "Come on," urged Aidan again. "It's what we mad English do whenever we get on a beach." And he proceeded to dig with his hands, moulding the sand into the beginnings of a central keep. Curiosity got the better of Davy at last, and Kirsty and Tiz watched with interest as an impressive sandcastle took shape in front of them. Chinn, however, took no part in this activity, but sat quietly by the wheelchair, watching impassively.
"I wonder what he's thinking," Kirsty asked herself.
As soon as they had finished eating their midday meal, Kirsty began to repack the picnic bag.
"I think we ought to be getting you and Tiz back soon," she said to Joy. "It's so hot." And shading her eyes, she looked across the sand to the nearby headland, where a dead tree had begun to shimmer in the heat. Before she had time to speak to Aidan, however, she saw Tiz bend her head and murmur something to Chinn. He immediately got up and went over to where Aidan and Davy were putting some finishing touches to the sandcastle, with small shells Davy had found at the water's edge. Chinn bent down and spoke to Aidan, but it was obvious that he didn't understand. Then both Davy and Chinn pointed out to the sea and back at Tiz. Eventually, Aidan got to his feet and came over to Kirsty with a troubled look on his face.
"Kirsty," he said quietly so that Tiz couldn't overhear. "Tiz has asked if she can go into the water. Do you think that's safe?" "I'm not sure it's a good idea in her weak state." Kirsty knew that he was right, and that it would be a foolish thing to do. But she also realised that this might be Tiz's last chance to go into the sea. So she looked at Aidan and whispered sadly,
I don't much think it matters too much now, does it? Aidan looked at her gravely, nodding his head.
You may go, he said, turning to Tiz, whose face immediately lit up with a radiant smile.
Obrigada, Dr. Aidan, she said simply.
Without more ado, Chinn picked Tiz up in his arms and carried her down the beach. Slowly he began to wade out into the shallow water of the bay. On and on they went, until it seemed to the watchers on the shore that they were never going to stop. At last, when the sea was nearly up to his waist, he halted.
Put me in the water, please, said Tiz, and Chinn lowered her gently into the sea so that it covered her small body. She then laid her head back, and her long dark hair flowed all around her, like strands of living seaweed, gently rising and falling with the pulsing rhythm of the ocean. Closing her eyes in ecstasy, she abandoned herself to its tender embrace, sensing that the water was somehow washing away the abuse of the years with its gentle caresses. She floated like this for a long time, and Kirsty, straining her eyes to watch from the shore, felt that she was seeing a Greek myth come alive, and that Tiz, like a Botticelli Venus, would rise up out of the water, radiantly beautiful, innocent, and whole again.
At last, Chinn bent down and whispered softly, Tiz, I think I'd better take you back now. Tiz opened her eyes and looked at him, almost as if she were seeing him for the first time.
I love you, Chinn, she said simply. I feel clean again now. Thank you for looking after me. Chinn smiled down at her, then tenderly lifted her out of the water and waded slowly shoreward. All around them the sea swirled and sparkled, and up above the sun shone in fierce strength, but neither noticed, as they were wrapped up in a timeless moment of deep intimacy.
All was quiet in the bus as it made its way back to the hospital. Tiz, Joy and Davi slept the whole way home, and Kirsty spent the journey pondering on what had happened in the water. Just where Tiz had been, when her body had been floating on the sea, she didn't know.
She looked so serene when Chinn laid her on the blanket, she mused. I've never seen a face look so peaceful before. What happened out there in the bay, I wonder?
By the time the minibus turned into the hospital gates, all the party were awake again. Aidan parked as near to Tiz's small room as he could, and Chinn carried her the rest of the way in his arms. As they got nearer, he bent his head and whispered to her, Yara and I have a surprise for you, Tiz. 2 more steps, and they were at the door, and there were Yara and Sister Maria, both smiling broadly. Chinn carried her inside, and what a sight met their eyes. Every conceivable space in the tiny room had been filled with flowers. There were flowers on the floor, on the windowsill, and on the locker. Flowers had been wreathed round the metal bars of the bedstead, and yet more laid on the coverlet. Yara had even placed 4 long-stemmed red roses on the pillow. The room indeed was ablaze with a kaleidoscope of colour, and a beautiful aroma wreathed itself around the 4 of them, like the smell of rare incense.
It's O Dia dos Namorados, remember? Said Yara with a catch in her voice. And Chinn and I want you to know that we love you. Now you just have to get better. Tiz said nothing, but her face shone with happiness as Chinn laid her gently on the bed.
But it was not to be. For that night Tiz lost her battle with AIDS. And so it was that by the time the morning sunlight crept through the tiny window, one small, withered little flower lay dead in a bower of beautiful blossom. Aidan was at home sitting at his desk. He'd turned the smallest bedroom in the house into a temporary office and was busily trying to compose a report for Dr. Ramirez. However, he was finding it almost impossible to focus on hospital matters, for his mind kept returning to the events of the last 48 hours. He tried hard not to dwell on them, but they were forever fixed in his brain and kept tumbling round and round inside his head, tormenting him. Eventually he gave up trying to work and sat back in his chair, letting his mind wander at will over the grim memories. Immediately he recalled the dreadful moment when he'd gone into Tiz's room early on the morning after their outing and found her dead among the flowers. In that instant he'd experienced a sense of failure so intense that he'd thought his spirit would break under the weight. Clasping his hand to his forehead, he tried to dislodge not only that memory, but also the sound of Kirsty's gratingly cheerful voice, saying to him, as she too gazed at Tiz,
"But darling, during her stay in hospital, her life was happier than it had ever been before." He recalled with shame that he'd snapped back at her.
"Not much comfort in that when she's dead, is there? Why couldn't we save this one patient above all the others?" he thought despairingly. God knows Dr. Ramirez tried. We all did our best, but we failed. His next memory was of Sister Maria coming into the small hospital room and saying matter-of-factly,
"Our funeral customs here are different to yours. Here the body has to be buried within 24 hours. Can you, Chinn and Yara, find enough money for a cheap funeral, do you think? Why not ask them? Then come and see me and I'll explain what else you have to do." The next problem had been presented to him when he'd gone to her office to say that the funeral could go ahead. He could see her now in his memory, sitting behind her large desk. So small, so old, but so alive. "It's the custom in this country," she'd announced after he'd sat down, "to have the body lying in its coffin in the home so that relatives can come to pay their last respects. However," she went on, "since Tiz has no home here, Mother Superior has given permission for her to rest in our small oratory in the grounds. It's also our custom," she explained, "not to leave the body alone. And since Davi is the only available relative and is so young, we must take it in turns to keep vigil with Tiz. I'll help, and so will some of the other sisters." She'd then taken from a drawer in the desk a plain white dress and given it to Aidan. "This is a postulant's habit," she informed him, getting up. "I'm afraid it's the best we can do to provide Tiz with a suitable shroud."
And so it was that Kirsty and Sister Maria laid Tiz out, dressed in a borrowed nun's habit. Kirsty had taken one of the red roses which Yara had placed on the pillow to welcome Tiz home the previous night, and put it on her breast in an attempt to relieve the severe whiteness of the dress. The bitter irony of the habit was not lost on Aidan, who had thought how tragic it was that one, who had been so sexually abused, should be dressed in the clothes of a celibate in death. She was then put in the cheapest coffin available, which was all they could afford. Aidan vividly recalled how he gazed down at the slight body, dressed in white, so pale and still.
There she lay in her shroud, in the same position on her back as he'd seen her first in the brothel. Then she'd been helpless in the face of his male strength. Now death had brutally prostrated her for the last time, and she would never experience what true love and happiness were. At that moment, he'd been completely overwhelmed by black despair.
His next painful memory was of Davi, who was allowed into the side ward once the coffin had been removed, in order to collect the flowers. He would never forget how the small boy had stumbled round the room, with tears streaming down his face as he tried to gather them into bunches. Aidan had helped him, and together they'd walked slowly across the convent grounds to the oratory. This turned out to be a simple building, consisting of a single room illuminated by a coloured window at one end. The open coffin had been placed in front of this, and the light coming in through the glass had softened the white of Tiz's shroud to a gentle pink. The only other objects in the room were two benches, one prayer desk, and to the left of the window, a statue of the Virgin Mary. Sister Maria had been kneeling at the prayer desk when they arrived, but she'd stood up immediately, taken the flowers, and arranged them on the floor round the coffin. Although most of them had begun to wilt, they were still beautiful, and Aidan had thought they looked like coloured rushes strewn on the flagstones of a medieval castle. You have been listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, safe place only can hide, trusting the nose to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere to run, wondering how your life could be so cruel, just like the others, so vulnerable. Surely in your dreams you would fly with an eagle, sheltered in his wings, soaring to the skies with the